So here we are, the first chapter of the book Iron John by Robert Bly, and like I said, went through the first chapter already, and there were some things I agree with Robert Bly on, and some I didn't, and there was some dated material in there. He went through some detail about the 50s and the 60s, which I didn't find particularly entertaining, but the essence of the story that he depicts, the pillow and the key is the title of the first chapter, and it's really about the character Iron John, which is the title of the book. That is where I'll be focusing on, and I think there's something else to point out before I begin, that although the story of Iron John is mythology or legend or myth, it isn't an explanation of the story of creation or a support of any particular religious ideology. What mythology is really intended for is two things. It was a way of communicating information and wisdom from generation to generation, and they did that in story. And our language is story. So as they told these stories to each other, from father to son, from mother to daughter, the wisdom there was a continuation of wisdom through culture. And so that was one of the main purposes. But then the other part of it is how to act into the world. It isn't an explanation of an afterlife or anything like that. It's how do you present yourself into the world in a moral way. And so some stories depict the way you should, and some depict the way you shouldn't. So those are the lessons, the bits of wisdoms to parse from it. So the first chapter is the pillow and the key, or let's say the pillow and the key, and the story starts like this. There's a king and a queen, and they live in a castle, and that castle is surrounded by a forest. And they started getting reports about people coming up missing when they entered into the forest. So they sent a group of soldiers into the forest, and they never returned, nothing to hear from them. So the king said, hey, we're not going into the forest anymore. And so this kind of starts off kind of interesting, because this is how we present ourselves in a tribal culture. We group ourselves in you want to call groups, and we see other groups, and this is a way to protect ourselves from different cultures or different ideas. And we put walls around ourselves, and that's a big topic now, is where we're going to put the wall, right? So there's something dangerous in the forest, and we're going to not go in there. We're going to restrict that. Well, along comes a hero, and this hero is kind of bored. He wants some adventure, and he asks the king, is there something I can do for you, something courageous? And he says, well, we're having all these people come up missing in the forest. You can go in there and find out what's going on, and maybe retrieve them. They'd be rewarded. And so, of course, the hero ventures into the forest, and he brings along only his dog. And so I think the hero and the dog are a representation of, and this is how our ancestors try to articulate how the mind works, is that the man represents the rational, articulate being, and the dog represents the instinctual being, the drives, like hunger or thirst, those instinctual things that we have. So they go into the forest, and they come across this lake, and the forest and the lake both represent in our culture as the potential of the future, or the things that could, good and bad, possibly happen to us. And so it's the unknown, it's the abyss of the unknown. And so as he goes into the forest, he comes across this lake, and as they're traveling along this lake, a hand comes out and grabs the dog and pulls him to the bottom. And of course, the hero is so shocked, he has to retrieve his dog. So he runs back to the castle, grabs a couple guys, gets some buckets, and they start racing to bail out the lake of water so that they can retrieve the dog. And I think what this represents is when our rational and emotional mind is not in alignment, that you can say, well, I lost my temper, right? Or I lost control of and I ate an entire cake or something. The instinctual part takes over. They're not in alignment with your rational goals. When you're not in alignment, we often do very tedious, hardworking, non-productive things like try to bail out an entire lake with buckets. So I hope that's pretty self-explanatory there. So as they get to the bottom, they find this hairy man, a red hair man, kind of a giant, and this is the character Iron John. And so they capture this guy and put him in chains and take him back to the castle, and they put him in a cage in the middle of the courtyard. And so, that kind of represents that, it doesn't kind of represents, Iron John represents the true masculinity, the true self, the man through the centuries that we now recognize as being only a partial man because of this sense of something missing. And that's what he represents, is the discovery of adulthood in the male view. So here comes the next character. So Iron John's sitting in the cage, and this boy, the son of the king and the queen, starts playing in the courtyard with this golden ball. And of course, the golden ball represents purity, it represents innocence, and the boy and the hero and the dog are all part of the same person, within the mind. It's parts, the personalities of the mind. And the hero is the one that ventures into the forest. The dog represents the instinctual part of the mind, and the boy represents the adolescent youth of every guy. And so he's playing with this ball in the courtyard, and the ball rolls into the cage of Iron John. And instead of asking for the ball, he just runs away scared. And this is representative of what we normally do as men when first confronted with the responsibility of adulthood. We run away. We're scared, and we don't say a word. We just take off running. And so a day goes by, and then the boy comes back in the courtyard, and he wants his ball back, but he's still scared. So he goes up to the cage, and this time he talks to Iron John and says, "Iron John, can you give me my ball back?" And Iron John says, "Sure, I'll give you the ball back, but you got to get the key and get me out of here." And Carl Jung often talked about that the rational mind and the personalities that occupy our mind also often negotiate with one another. And this is kind of kind of alludes to the negotiation of the rational and the instinctual, emotional self coming into agreement. And of course, in this part of the story, the little boy gets scared again, and so, but at least he at least acknowledged and faced his adulthood at this point. And so he runs away. And then of course the next day comes, and he approaches the cage again, and he asks Iron John for the ball back again. And of course Iron John responds the same way: "I'll give you the ball, you got to get the key." The boy responds, "Well, I don't know where the key is." Well, at the beginning of the story, I told you that the king locked up Iron John and gave the key to the queen. And so the king represents the traditional father, the queen represents the traditional mother. And so I think what the story is saying is that the mother holds the keys to the boy, and also holds the key to the boy's adulthood. And Robert Bly makes a lot of points in his analysis about doing a separation from the mother. And I think there's some validity to that. I think he kind of goes overboard a bit, but the essence of it is that you have to leave your mother, you have to leave your father in order to be an adult. But so where's the key, right? What's the key to adulthood? And I think that's the question here. If you ask yourself the question, where's the key? Well, the key is under the queen's pillow. The story. So, what does the boy do? Does he go to the queen and ask for the key? Well, the queen's going to say, no, you can't let that thing out. Does he go in and steal the key? So, this is I guess, the question for men in their lives is, how do they separate themselves? How do they enter into adulthood the right way? And there might not necessarily be a ethical right way, at least according to the story. And so, what the boy does is he ends up going to the bedroom where the key's at when the king and queen aren't there, and stealing the key. And he goes down and unlocks the cage and gets the ball back, and he's got his innocence in his hands, but now he's confronted with the consequence, right? And the consequence is that he's going to get punished for letting Iron John out. So he says this, I don't know, you can't leave. If you leave, then they'll know that I let you out, and I'll be severely punished. And in this part of the story, there's a resistance, a reluctance in our culture to move into adulthood. And there's a lot of things that will allow us not to grow up, and there's some things that will resist us not to grow up. And so this is one of the confrontations in the story. And remember, this story is very old, right? So these are kind of truths that have been around for mankind for a very long time. So, these same questions that we pose to ourselves now were posed hundreds, thousands of years ago by essentially the same type of people that we are. So in the story, what ends up happening is that he leaves the ball behind. He leaves the innocence of childhood and follows Iron John into the forest. And so he enters back into the unknown of the world, the potentiality of possibilities, but he leaves with Iron John, which represents, of course, true masculinity. And so the moral of the story is that there is a journey that has to take place, and that journey is confronted with challenges and moral questions, and it shows that oftentimes we'll back away from responsibility. We back away from what we know what we should do, and because we're fearful or maybe even ashamed. But if we keep confronting, acknowledging what's really in front of us, and keep confronting, we can get stronger and stronger until we have the courage to grab a hold of our adulthood. And I think that's the moral of the story. So that's it for chapter 1. I would appreciate any comments, any concerns, any outright complaints. I'm more than happy to receive those because, I'm just one guy with one opinion.